Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the Wars Rebellion podcast for Age Soul War. I'm your host, Niels Eichhorn, and today my Arkansas heart bleeds a little bit. I am joined by a faculty member at Texas A&M. I have, make sure I get this all right, Shae Smith Cox with me. She is a newly baked assistant professor of history with a focus on public history at Texas A&M. She was previously at Nichols State in the great state of Louisiana. She also has a PhD in history from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where she worked, I would assume, with a great Western Civil War era historian. We'll have him on the podcast at some point. We are going to talk today about her new book, which is, and I have it here as a LSU, I like the actual books to get, The Fabric of Civil War Society, Uniforms, Badges, and Flags, 1859 to 1939. So first of all, Shae, thank you so much for joining us today and being on the podcast and to talk about your book.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I told Shae before we started, when we corresponded, that I wanted to start today with a little anecdote to see what her reaction is. And for that, I have to say, like public historian speaking, I was in a public history graduate seminar at Georgia State a few years back when I was taking some classes after graduation with a PhD. And I had a material culture professor as the public historian teaching this introduction course. And she also was a postmodernist. And she made this interesting comment in class, whether it was to tease me or honest, I don't know, but I was curious what Shae's reaction to this is, that it would be impossible for us to know what Civil War uniforms actually looked like.
Uh, n no. How is it impossible?
Well, she's a postmodernist, right? So she would assume that you can't know because every uniform would have been slightly different. Everything would have been a little like made in its own ways, customized. So you
Okay.
wouldn't be able to know for sure what each and everyone's uniform looked like.
Each and every one, probably not, because we have to account for literally every homespun, every manufacturing, every stolen, discarded, weird dye job of a piece of uniform, or just indigenous people who customize their
Mm.
uniforms themselves, and African American people and how they had to switch types of uniforms. So each and every single one of them know, but we can get a pretty good idea as to what we think these things look like.
That's what I saw too, but I didn't want to make a fuss in class at the time. I was a student after all.
It's true.
So origin of the book. I'm going to
Mhm.
turn this into a fun one too, because which came first? Chicken egg, right?
Right.
Did your interest start with Civil War uniforms, or did you collect Civil War uniforms and stuff before you st wrote the book?
So I didn't start collecting until I was well into the material for the the my dissertation. So this is obviously my dissertation turned
Mhm.
very drastically into a different way, a book. Um, and I didn't start collecting until probably 2018, 2019, because I started my PhD in 2015. Um, and it's been I mean, I still see pieces where I just pick them up and bring and bring them and have you can probably see the archival boxes behind my head, and there are more on a bookshelf over here of where all my materials live and the
Mm.
climate controlled place that they stay in. But yeah.
It is a problem when you live in the humid South.
hmm So you got to keep it really cool and comfortable and check on things often. But they're
Yes.
really great I get to use them for teaching materials and part of my teaching
Mhm.
collection
Yeah.
now. So they have multiple lives, even just with my existence.
Cool. That is so cool. So how does somebody get interested in writing a dissertation then about uniforms, flags, buttons, badges?
So I started, honestly, it was all because of public history course. I love the Civil War. I've studied the Civil War since I was an undergrad, but I did not realize, I don't know, you grow up in the typical narrative of,
Mm-hmm.
especially in the South, like this is the way things are. Here is what you study. And all of those things are valid, but they don't fit me.
Mm-hmm.
So I started looking at the Civil War uniforms because I was in a project course and I was working for the Mob Museum in Las Vegas. And the project course was Prohibition in the
Mm-hmm.
1920s. And it was a course specifically over women's dresses. So women's wear of the 20s, how their life changed. And we could show technology and consumerism
Mm-hmm.
and fashion and independence.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I was working really intently with that and hadn't found what I wanted to do for my dissertation yet. And thought, I wonder if Civil War uniforms, how hard was it to like Lincoln's Call for Troops,
Mm-hmm.
75,000 men. How difficult was it to put those bodies in uniforms? And I couldn't find an answer.
Mm-hmm.
So I just kept digging and realized that I didn't no one's really asked that
Right.
weird of a question before. And I'm like, I kind of wonder, like it led me into
Mm-hmm.
manufacturing and politics and economics and then sentimentality and identity. So that's a long answer to say public history
No, that's
and a
cool.
personal interest.
Yeah, like I remember I had turned my U.S. survey course into a sort of public history focused course, and
Mm,
the 1920s Prohibition was sort of a tough one because there's so little public history, and actually
mhm,
Mob Museum was one thing I kind of briefly looked at if I could use it in some form.
mhm.
So that's cool. That's really cool.
Well, thank you.
Um, so man, there's so much in there. So it's a fascinating book, especially considering material culture is such a understudied subject with regard to the Civil War, I would say.
Mm, I mean, yes, I think that we've started making strides.
Hmm.
I mean, Joan Cashin
Yeah.
obviously is like foundational. You have to have
Mhm.
her. But with the other books in like war materials and objects of war, they kind of pave the way for the my book to be able to
Mhm.
happen. And the idea of how memory also, because I never planned to take it that far. I thought it was going to just be a Civil War
Yeah.
book. And then for a seminar course, was reading Karen Cox and Caroline
Hmm.
Janey and went, oh no, it's gonna be longer. So, because of them as well, like I'm able to just keep the whole party going up until the 1930s. And you have to have a cutoff somewhere, because obviously, but 1939 seems like a pretty good place
I
to
guess you could
end
have
for
done the
now.
movies.
Yes, I mean, like Gone with the Wind was kind of my cutoff because
Okay.
Margaret Mitchell uses the a whole like she interviews Confederate veterans
Mhm.
and is able to kind of craft, and that's how she crafts part of her book, right?
Right.
And so going with Gone with the Wind, and that's really what ingrains in people's heads that
Mhm.
for all of its flaws and issues, that movie people still believe is iconic and classic. And whenever you watch it, you imagine that's what they looked like. But really,
Mhm.
what she's talking about are like veterans materials. So,
Yeah, that sort of was a kind of question that I was having as I was reading your book, because you really clearly again and again point out that Confederate uniforms were not gray. They were various shades, various colors, sort of
Mm,
butternut being the kind of go-to usually that we use.
mm,
And I kind of wondered where did this Confederate gray or in like the movies oftentimes puts them in kind of like old movies, not the newer ones, but older
mm,
movies just kind of put them in gray. And like I remember like, toys that they were gray. And how
mm.
does it come that we have this assumption or had this assumption popularly that Confederates were gray?
Well, that's what we're supposed to. Like, I mean, they were supposed to.
No,
It was
supposed
chosen
to.
to it was chosen to mock the cadet uniforms, and because in
Mm,
gray was a very simple economically efficient color of material to be able to get a hold of, and with the color and the weight of the cloth and the economics, it made a whole lot of sense, which is also why the US was wearing gray a whole lot of the time. It
right.
was the cheapest thing to outfit people in. And we, it's not until I think it's because they have these official manuals of
Hmm.
this is the color, this is where you purchase it, this is how it looks for both the US and the Confederacy. And whenever the you like there are so many deadly mix-ups and people go, oh no. We have to figure out a way to differentiate ourselves. And the US decides in, I think, September of 61 on an official blue, which their blues are not all the same either because you have multiple manufacturers. Um, that's when it becomes Confederate gray, but also how do you ensure neither one of them were prepared. You can't ensure that there's no quality control here, especially with manufacturing whenever the Confederacy is having to get their material, most of it from England. So they have it's what it's supposed to be. It's what is iconic. And then whenever the United Confederate Veterans create their own veterans uniforms, that is when again, it is officially noted. This is the same gray. This is what we're supposed to look like. And that's kind of how our memory works because we forget what happens before.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And it's sort of what I was thinking about when you were talking that this issue, right, of like it's so much in our face sometimes that like I mean you read a battle story of Manassas and it's like, oh, this I think it was an Indiana unit where it's
Mhm.
gray and they
Hmm.
got shot at. And then you
Hmm.
have like another unit that's wearing blue and they got shot at
Right.
accidentally. And it's
Hmm.
like it's right in your face. It's sort of like weather, right? I remember when I had a conversation with Kenneth Snow, and it was like they always talked about weather. We just never looked at it.
Yeah. It's one of those things that because of our consumer culture, we take that whole thing for granted.
Hmm.
We do not understand or pay attention to how difficult it actually was to create these garments. And that's something I really love about Laura Edwards and her work. Because it's the she lines out the power that goes in
Hmm.
them. And that's just these and the care and the process. And that's just not something that our society thinks about anymore because we have such easily ready-made garments.
Right. Yeah, yeah, no. So that leads me to another question that I wanted to know, considering you have uniforms there behind you, and there's
Yeah.
some that have survived in museums in various places.
Hmm.
How good a quality is it? Because I mean, you kind of have this image, right? Like, oh, the uniform fell apart on them after Sherman's march to the Carolinas because
Hmm.
it just they have been wearing it for weeks now and been on the march and fought and damaged stuff. So how durable is this uniform?
Well, it depends on what stage in the war that you were talking about. So, one of
Oh.
my favorite stories is the shoddy uniforms for the US early on because
Mm,
um, you have all of these manufacturers and these clothiers who are scrambling for government contracts and they want
mhm,
the money because it's going to come. And what they really they're pushing for is to try to get these pieces out as fast as possible.
Mm,
And if they don't have the material or something falls through, they're literally sweeping up junk off of the floor and stitching it together and calling it good. And that is why I have a story in the book about this reporter who is at this camp and he cannot, for the life of him, figure out it's like 80 degrees outside and you've got your greatcoat on.
mhm,
Why do you
right.
have this coat on? And the soldiers admit that they're really embarrassed that their breeches are ripped. They have their holes and like you're gonna show something if you don't keep
Right.
your coat on. So whenever it is reported in the South that the North has shoddy uniforms, it's just this point of
Mm,
it's a laughing stock. And
right.
then other Northern clothiers are like, we don't do like they use that as a
Mm,
point of we don't do that. We're much better than that. And so as the war rolls on, the quality for the uniforms gets better, and especially for the North. Um, but in the South, they do well in we don't really hear stories of shoddy for them, but it's just a little bit of a different process because of where they get their stuff up front.
mm, of course. Yeah. Yeah, makes sense. And I mean, it also depends on how active, I guess, your unit would have been during the conflict.
Yes. And how long, because there are I firmly believe that quartermasters are the unsung heroes of a war because you have to figure out how the logistics and what you need and how to get it to
Mhm,
people and you check it out, you check it back in. It's that's what a lot of the materials were because it's
mhm,
like a 6 month policy or like a few months in a policy, and
mhm,
you have to go based on what's available in the season. And so some things that they were checking back in were in really bad shape. But it is because of constant wear, because you only have 2 to 3 sets of something, and what happens when
mhm,
it wears through?
mhm.
Do
Yeah.
you have the money to get any more?
Hmm.
Are you going to die in debt to the government for your materials?
Yeah, that was fascinating that the soldiers actually had to pay for all the different aspects of their uniform, and I, I don't think it was quite dread that the stories that you described there of like the one soldier who's like, yeah, it's payday, but a lot of my money will go to the quartermaster for the uniform.
hmm It's it's just something sad that they kind of accept.
Hmm.
That it's they are charged different prices for different pieces, and based on your previous economic situation, how ready you are to be able to meet that, and who needs the money at home, right?
Right. Yeah.
So, especially for formerly enslaved people, they had
Hmm.
not only were they paid less, but they also had to pay for their uniforms.
Hmm.
And you don't have clothes coming, like solid clothes that you can really use coming in,
Hmm.
and then you may die. And that's why I kept making that comment of die in debt to the government because so many did.
Hmm.
They owed money to the government for their clothing.
Well, they couldn't collect that debt at least.
At least I couldn't collect that debt, but yes, it's one of those like, oh my goodness, you are making it impossible for people to survive.
Yeah.
And then the clothiers themselves, like whenever these companies would put out the ads and have a
Hmm.
regiment or an outfit come in, they could gouge price whatever, however they
Right.
wanted to.
Yeah.
So anything from $16 to $25, some
Right.
of them were much more expensive. So
Right.
I think one preacher had to spend 600 for a year, which made no sense, but their clothing was different than the regular uniform. And so you can't, yeah, you couldn't, yeah, it was just all different.
That's so weird.
So,
But I think based on what you're just saying, we should also talk about who is obtaining the uniforms, right? Because there's these all these units are in service of the United States or the Confederate States, but they're all
mm,
state sponsored.
right.
In some cases, they are private citizens who put these together. So
Mhm.
how does that determine who obtains the uniforms, who kind of decides what they are looking like, what hats they wear, what color
So
pants, etc.
depending on whether you are infantry or artillery or cavalry or, I mean, so that's all going to have a designation with your colors and eventually the regimental badges in like 63 that are placed on your clothing and that help identify you,
Hmm.
who you are, and where you belong. But if people are trying to, I mean, there are societies or groups that will raise funds on both sides that raise funds to help create that. But until there's formal regulation, there's really not a whole. it- it's free game. You really can just kind of wear what you want. One of the fun things is that the Zouave uniforms they were given as prizes. So
Right.
you drill, you do a splendid job, you get a new set of uniforms, and you look great. Um, but how long do they hold up? Are they right for the weather? Um, yeah, there's the whole like previous military understanding of clothing also works its way in there. Um, one of the African American stories from a journal that I was reading, I mean a diary, I'm sorry, was that whenever those Zouaves uniforms got cast off and there was the official, everyone's going to wear hopefully this color and this shape.
Mhm.
Um, some of the soldiers, like the African American soldiers, ended up with those uniforms because they were checked back into service. And
Oh,
then what are they going to wear? And
hand-me-downs.
hand-me-downs, used hand-me-downs that are sometimes in good shape, sometimes not. But also with that coloring, it's they complained of being a target.
Hmm, that's interesting because I just
So,
finished the that new book on the Zouaves with Brown and Harrison,
mhm.
and they actually kind of seem to indicate more that it's a good thing. These uniforms were actually comfortable and helped protect you and all that.
Flexibility. I mean, you
Yeah,
cannot beat the fact that you can do calisthenics in those uniforms. You can move
right.
around, you're not stiff. Um, but that coloring,
Yeah, I mean red.
some sources, yeah, red. Some sources say that it was definitely an issue
Yeah,
personally to people.
spurs you on. Just
Mhm.
don't get shot.
Yeah, don't get
But
shot.
you did mention the kind of the feel of the uniform for sort of the environment. And I
Mm.
always remember that I took a group of students a few years ago to Vicksburg and we did Sayer's Approach.
Hmm.
Actually made them walk it up. And all of us
Wow.
were all were kind of summer clothes, obviously, and they were all exhausted. It was June. So it was
Hmm.
perfectly fitting right about the same time of year.
Right.
And I kind of told him, like, imagine now that you have to wear those heavy uniforms that the soldiers wore.
Hmm. And your backpacks. Don't forget
And
your
the
stuff.
backpack, yeah, and the muskets, and somebody
Hmm.
shooting at you.
Hmm. Do that with all of this. It's
They
fascinating.
they really didn't care much. Or, well, I guess there wasn't really any other materials that they could have used for these uniforms to make them more like suitable for the southern climate, was there?
No, not really. It was too, I mean, with how things are manufactured and shipped back and forth across the Atlantic, there were not, there just weren't the options to make it cooler. Which is why you have entire companies that will shirk their uniforms and how they get picked up by other people
Right.
and
Yeah.
um, they just start shedding everything without a
Mhm.
care of how much it's going to cost them later because it's hot and it's heavy.
Yeah. If you're on the march, you don't care,
Hmm.
like you said. So the another scene that I really enjoyed in your book was sort of the pride that the uniform gave the soldiers, right? That they kind of they felt having a uniform was something special. And
Mhm.
I feel like that cuts two different ways, but I want to start with the uniform because it sort of is the Civil War is sort of a period of creating nationalism in the United States, and it felt like the uniforms were a very important part of crafting this volunteer force into a coherent army that then
Mhm.
gave meaning to the country during the war and after.
Mhm. So, I mean, it kind of works both ways in both sides,
Hmm.
right? So, um, for the honestly, for the Confederacy, like they spend over $1 million in the first few months of the war creating uniforms. And what does that do? It creates nationalism. It's not just patriotic sentiment, it is the
Hmm.
development of nationalism. And it I'm gonna say indoctrination, but
Hmm. Yeah,
I mean, but that's really what it is, right? So
I call
it
it imagining a community.
imagine, yes, we'll borrow that one. They're gonna create this imagined
Yeah.
community and allow for this iconic thought of like the iconic of an image
Hmm.
to like take hold, right? And again, that's how it's what it was supposed to be like. That's why we have this in our brains. That you're in gray and blue.
Hmm.
So it's used as a not only nationalism but identity crafting for an
Hmm.
individual.
Right.
And a couple years in, that's how you start hearing like Johnny Reb and Billy Yank, right? So
Hmm.
it's just you see that person and you associate them
Hmm.
with a standing. What we wear and what we put on our bodies says so much about who we are and what we believe. And they're literally wearing their politics on their person,
Hmm.
um, in many cases. So in the US, it kind of helps, but more so for, I would argue for Native people, because it's the whole idea of community,
Hmm.
citizen, like the idea of citizenship, even though
Hmm.
citizenship is not offered. Um, and also for African American people, it's
Hmm.
that overwhelming transformation from I mean, especially for those who were formerly enslaved, there were very specific rules about enslaved people and what they could wear and what they could go out in public and what they could be seen in. And you transform from those things into a military uniform that's just like the white regiment. That
Hmm.
says a lot. It's not even I mean, it's a physical transformation, but it's also a mental transformation.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And I need to keep in mind where I wanted to go, but
Sorry.
I really enjoyed that you included Native Americans. Like, was that sort of like how did you decide that Native Americans like belonged into this narrative too? Was it sort of like a natural thing? Did you just stumble on some Native American like materials? Like what? How did that come about?
So I'm from Oklahoma,
Never
um,
mind.
originally, and in where I grew up,
Hmm.
I mean the Potawatomi lands, Seminole lands,
Yeah,
Choctaw, Chickasaw, it's all around me.
yeah.
And a good portion of my elementary school, I think 40% at that point were
Hmm.
Native people. And so it was just kind of a natural idea in to start
Hmm.
with. Um, and then whenever I was trying to find I had two really good friends in my PhD program who encouraged me. They're like, it's going to be hard, but don't give up.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
because they are indigenous and they were like, this is a valuable story that needs to be
Hmm.
told, and no one tells the story.
Right.
So, getting at Native stories, the only way I felt like I could even start uncovering some things was through
Mhm.
material culture because so much of it isn't
Right.
written. So much of it
Yeah.
is, I mean, it's also the government that writes their stories. So, um, in the official record, and
Mm-hmm.
you just trying to pull that out, um, and see not only what it's like during the war, but also how Native people commemorate and
Mm-hmm.
how important it is for many of the groups that participated on both the US and the Confederacy side. It's,
Yeah.
I don't know, I just that was something that was significant to me. And I did
Yeah.
not get as much as I wanted. And I think that there's still so much more that you can
Mm.
do. And so I encourage someone to go out and like give this a shot for me or let me
Yeah.
help you. But I think that yeah, it's just something that we always think of it being
Mhm.
mostly like a black and white war.
Yeah.
And there are other people who get caught in the middle and they get punished and
Yeah.
exchanged, and it's not, I don't know, they deserve to
Yeah.
be heard too.
Yeah. No, as I said, it was really refreshing to see. And it was interesting to like see those different meanings that people then brought to it and brought their customs to those.
Mhm.
So I did like that you also already mentioned memory because the uniforms weren't just, it seemed important in creating sort of a nationalism during the war, but maintaining it after, as Confederates continue wearing the uniforms, and then veterans organizations
Mhm.
create new ones.
Yes. So, the I find that the period of Reconstruction is fascinating
Mhm.
because of, I mean, so you have the Civil War, you have the uniforms, the badges, the flags, we have it all established. Here we
Mhm.
go. And then we move into Reconstruction, where Union soldiers are encouraged to, dear people, put these in your trunks, remember them later, maybe take them out to show your grandchildren. Well done. Um, and Southern people are like Confederates are, oh my gosh, cover that up. Don't you dare. Like,
Mhm.
none of this. This is treason. You
Yeah.
understand this. And then they rebel and they get really angry against it. And then you've got these other groups caught in the middle with like the formerly enslaved people
Mhm.
who are still in service, still wearing
Right.
uniforms, and they are policing the military districts of the South. So it's
Mhm.
just really crazy power dynamic that is literally played out through clothing, which again is was done on purpose by Grant.
Mhm.
And you can see through his writings and through his things like how it works.
Mhm.
Um, but I find that to be fascinating. And then the memories that are pulled from the Civil War and Reconstruction and how they decide to create those things. I love that the Grand Army of the Republic Veterans Organization is like an immediate,
Mhm.
this is how we're going to start remembering. We've got to, I mean, it's also used as like
Mhm.
a safety group, right? Because although we don't acknowledge PTSD from this time period and we don't get shell shock till like World War One,
Mhm.
we know that there is trauma,
Yeah. Yeah.
and mental distress. And so, like, the fact that these organizations thrive and
Mhm.
are able to build different communities through stuff
Yeah.
is what I find to be the most fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the camaraderie, right? The community
Mm.
that you have. And oh, that is actually the perfect lead over to the other one I
Okay.
wanted to go.
Good.
Because um I had the honor to see a couple of Jim Ogden's beautiful battlefield tours at Chickamauga, Chattanooga. He's the park
Oh.
historian there.
Hmm.
And I always remember the moment where I think it was on a tour group and somebody asked about, I think it's the acorn for the 14th Corps,
Hmm.
and how it was like 11th and 12th Corps from the East came over. The Cumberland vets look at this and are like, "What? Why are you wearing these weird stickers things on your uniform?" And they explain like that's our unit badges for like the unit we're in. We have sort of this thing, and then
Hmm.
they adopt their own, and it's sort of like it. It's interesting because right, it's a unit pride and the unit
Right.
identity that goes with that.
Yes. It's the once those regimental badges were created, it allows and then are carried over into the mem I like to call it the memory machine phase, because I really do view those four main organizations
Hmm.
as machines.
Yeah.
Um, but whenever we carry it over into that phase, it's the ability to keep that piece of you
Hmm.
and then to inspire others to create like that same type of thing is fascinating to me.
How much does that also kind of help with sort of we used it earlier today and had to explain it to students, sort of the esprit de corps, right? It's a kind of mm, friendly rivalry within an army. How much does it help with that too?
Um, well, I mean, it's friendly, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
it's and that's the nice part about it is that it is it's it's exciting for them to be able to have a distinction, but
Hmm.
also have a connection. So
Hmm.
you can see all of the groups that were from a specific battle, who fought at a specific place, and you can kind of whenever it comes to remembrances and the veterans badges, and
Hmm.
the other things that are created by the United Daughters of Confederacy or the Women's Relief Corps that go along with it. You can see how those symbols play through
Hmm.
and how they are able to distinguish each other and be like,
Hmm.
oh, well, this was your symbol and you were here.
Yeah.
So it helps. It's all connected. If that makes sense.
That, as you were talking was sort of the kind of badges for campaigns and battles, and
Hmm.
I kind of was taken back. I forget who's the author is, but the guy that wrote the book on Mexico, the Remembering the Mexican War. He's at Georgia Southern, and he noted that the United States never creates any medals for the war with Mexico, but Mexico creates like I think it's 7 or 8 medals for
Hmm.
different campaigns. So it was very unusual for the United States, sort of in the Anglo tradition, to do something like that. So we only have the Medal of Honor. How
Hmm.
much do sort of these veteran medals, badges, like you have like the like things like that, how much does that sort of stand in for the veterans as sort of recognition of their service?
So for the veterans themselves, I mean, it's really the organizations as a whole, because we can't
Hmm.
forget the women. Um, they again, it's like, I mean, you're wearing your politics on your
Hmm.
body.
Right.
You have membership badges
Hmm.
for these organizations. Um, you pay for those badges.
Hmm.
You
Yeah.
are mustered, like especially for the GAR, you're mustered out based on
Hmm.
conduct. If you don't behave yourself, you don't get to stay. So what it means to wear the badges for the men is a little bit different. Um, I believe it's a little bit different than what it means for the women, because
Hmm.
the Women's Relief Corps and the United Daughters of the Confederacy create their own badges, and it is distinguished.
Hmm.
You don't get to you can only be in their badge and like be in their club and wear their badge if you did what they did, right? So it's like a Mean Girls, like you can't sit with us, um, issue. Yeah, I know it sounds crazy and it's
No, it
funny,
doesn't.
but
I
like,
work at a boarding school.
but it is literally like a Mean Girls. You can't sit with us.
Yeah.
We need some, and that's their claim to fame, right? Like that's their recognition. They don't get uniforms.
Yeah.
They have to have that. And if they are at a parade and they look nice, but you've got this badge on, you know exactly where they
Mm.
belong and what they stood for and what they still stand for. And that's literally for all of them. The veterans get to be a little less contentious about it, but the women sure don't.
Unless, of course, it's that one UDC badge that gets faked,
Counterfeited over
counterfeited
and
there.
over. So their membership
Still is
badge is
fun.
is is counterfeited constantly. But also the Southern Cross of Honor
Mm.
is counterfeited constantly, which we don't hear those same stories for a Grand Army of the Republic. It's kind of
Oh.
fascinating that you need this is what you want. This is what you need to have.
Oh. It's interesting because I'm seeing sort of a Dombi's book in that and sort of how many of these veterans fake it,
Uh-huh.
especially in later years, or like, oh, I'm faking my Confederate allegiance because I can get money out of it. It feels a lot like
Hmm.
that.
It is a lot like that because it's that it is fake prestige or it is
Yeah.
fake honor.
Yeah.
In certain circles, that means so much. And they continue to make those badges, especially the Southern Cross of Honor, I think through Vietnam. Um, they go a long way,
Hmm.
definitely through World War One and Two. I think the last one is Vietnam. Um,
Can you spot a fake?
uh, actually, if you put them out and like I can hold
Hmm.
them, yes. Especially well, Civil War ones
Hmm.
specifically, because oftentimes they're lighter. They're not
Okay.
made of the same material, and the printing of the wording is off.
Oh,
So like it's
okay.
askew enough.
Yeah.
Like I've seen enough real ones to I one of my favorite
So
things
the
about
the
this
fakes
this
are too
dissertation.
perfect.
Well, no, the fakes are the ones who are a little goofy. Like
Okay.
they're the ones that are skewed ever so slightly. Because
Okay.
the best part about my project was I not only was I in an archive, but I got to go spend time with curators and registrars
Hmm.
and to sit for hours in their collections and in their space and
Right.
have them show me piece after piece after piece.
Hmm.
And getting like those conversations and those relationships were invaluable. Like I
Hmm.
would not trade any of that for the world. Even the Grand Army of the Republic posts in like Lynn and Marblehead, Massachusetts, where I was literally just given free reign to this one post. And like
Hmm.
he spent 2 or 3 hours taking me around to all of the things and letting me like with gloves carefully like hold and see stuff. So it's yeah, no, it was very, very cool. But spotting fakes is now something I can start to
All
do.
right. You have a TV shows that you can
Pumped.
do.
Yeah.
Antiques Roadshow for silver artifacts.
Antiques Roadshow for Civil War artifacts.
Wonderful. Now there's at least two more things I want to at least touch on today.
Of course.
And we could spend another hour, but you have an appointment with a museum.
I do.
So again, anecdotes. I distinctly remember like I was my first year, first summer out of PhD on the job in a job, and I decided to volunteer. I think it was the 4th of July at Andersonville in Georgia. It's the Andersonville National Historic Site for
Oh,
that
cool.
old Civil War
Okay.
prison.
Mm.
And quality controls that they do, they wanted to see the script before.
Hmm.
And I had the story of a couple of women that got exposed there
Hmm.
as fakes, as soldiers that had, well, women that had put on the soldier's uniform. And distinctly remembers a comment in the margin was like, we don't talk about those cross dressers.
Oh,
And it was kind of like, okay, that's fine. I don't want to. But I really found your section then extremely refreshing because there was one woman in particular that you said they didn't even figure out that she was.
several women that they don't figure out. I mean, most of the
Well,
time they don't figure out that unless they are wounded or die that they were women. Which is
part
kind
of
of
me
the
is like, how can you be so oblivious?
well, I mean, let's think about the size difference then, right?
Hmm.
So I am 5'3". Um, I'm I could probably I mean, I don't know, I'm getting older now, but like I could probably pass. If I like pull my hair, like if you cut your hair, if you
Hmm.
are going through the process of I mean, they're not eating super well, right?
Right.
So
No,
everyone is
they're
skinny.
skinny. Yeah.
Um, and you're just a smaller body type then
Hmm.
anyway. Um, if you are going through the entire process of being a Civil War soldier, then as long as you can hold those mannerisms and you
Hmm.
don't have to be undressed in front of anybody, you
Hmm.
can you could probably pass for quite some time. I mean, there are
Hmm.
women in there who pass for over a year, 18 months, 2 years, and are successful at it.
Right.
And the other thing that people rely on is other women who are in those positions to keep their secrets.
Yes.
For
Yeah.
entire groups of people to keep their secrets. And if
Mm.
you're yeah, it's the value system of that, especially whenever you don't figure out, like if they start to rise through the ranks and you're just like, oh, you were a woman. Oops. And you get you are mustered out and discharged, then it is then there's some issues. But what is it? Sarah Edmondson is the only woman who was allowed in the GAR.
Mm.
And then yeah, for the Veterans Organization. And she passed for a while.
Yeah. I mean, it was it's crazy to imagine, right? The horrors that you go through in the Civil War.
Mm.
Like I mean, death is constantly on you,
Hmm.
whether it's on the battlefield or from diseases in the camps, and that you're that patriotic, I guess, to say, yes, I'm going to do this.
I mean, some of it is patriotic, right? Some of it is they
Right.
follow their
Yeah.
husbands or their
Yeah.
boyfriends or their family members
Yeah.
into war. And that bond is not something
Mm.
to, I mean, be
Mm.
shirked or laughed at, I guess. So
Yeah.
it's, I mean, and just their ability and the resolve that they have to be able to stay in those positions is fascinating.
Yeah.
I would love to see more on
Hmm.
that idea. They Fought Like Demons is like the one of the
Yeah.
last really good books
Hmm.
from that. But it's just to think of in those women's positions of how freeing it
Hmm.
must have been to be
Yeah.
able to not only be in that different type of clothing, but also
Hmm.
the social freedom that they would have
Yeah.
had to be able to walk that way.
Yeah. And I would think in the current political environment, that would be a really important book to kind of put out there again, to kind of remind people
Hmm.
that for somebody else to write.
For somebody else to write.
Um, the other interesting one that I kind of was really drawn to as you explored this was Black Confederates, because it's such a contentious topic, and
Um,
all of the video materials, I think it was the first time I actually did a video interview was with Kevin before I was
mhm,
talking to the Atlanta History Center when he had just brought out Searching for Black Confederates. So
mhm.
in part, where do you stand with it? Where do you change the narrative?
So I felt the need to include that part in the Civil War portion of the book and also in the memory portion of the book, because I fall in their camp. I I mean what Kevin and then Adam
Mhm.
Dombey, it's it's sound scholarship. So in the actual Civil War, when the South got desperate enough, yeah,
Mhm.
sure, they're going to turn to this idea. Um, and my favorite part was you're going to drill people. So what are they going to like? I love the question, what are you going to wear?
Mhm.
And so the fact that it's like, well, do they wear cast-offs from
Mhm.
Confederates? What do they do with this material? And the deal
Mhm.
is we never get that far. We
Yeah.
never have any organized military body of
Mhm.
Black Confederates.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's where the conversation ends. That's where the
Mhm.
war falls apart. So there we go. But whenever it comes back in, what I love to follow and just found fascinating was the mental gymnastics that went into what the UDC and the UCV were willing to create,
Mhm.
fabricate, and
Mhm.
then accept and push
Mhm.
because you're literally fighting a war to preserve enslavement.
Mhm.
We all know that and understand it. Number two, you you get so angry that there could possibly be a body servant that was on a battlefield and you will
Mhm.
deny anything to them.
Right.
You will barely acknowledge their presence. And then you start trotting out, like the third phase is you're trotting out formerly enslaved people
Mhm.
who you cover in Confederate veteran paraphernalia from head to toe, like Jefferson Shields, and
Mhm.
you use them as tokens to
Yes.
put forth this narrative. So just to watch the creation of a
Mhm.
narrative through material objects is absolutely fascinating to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was very drawn into that because in part I kind of felt like you're suggesting because Kevin I feel like suggests that it sort of like was roots since the 80s where really starts this popularization of Black Confederate, but you're seeming to suggest that we're starting to see it by the 19 teens, 20s already, that they're already starting to kind of create this narrative.
Mhm. They're having to create the narrative because a
Yeah.
lot of their veterans, they're gone. They've
Yeah.
died. So until you turn to the children, who else? I mean, and these women most of the time are not going to blow their own horn and try and memorialize themselves. So for the most part,
Mhm.
so how else do you perpetuate this narrative that you have
Mhm.
crafted so carefully and are hanging on to for dear life?
That, oh, I want to say Kevin had like a picture in one of it in his book or in his presentation where it's like there's this, or was it on his website? I forget where it was, but like there was this group of seven at a Florida reunion, and like one of them wore this kind of little badge, and I think
Hmm.
he kind of enhanced help had help enhancing it and sort of said slave on it. Did any of that kind of stuff survive? Like the
I
stuff they're
mean,
wearing?
in terms of veteran things,
Yeah, like Black Confederate veteran, quote unquote, uh,
um, I'm
memorabilia.
I'm sure that but by the time that they begin dressing African American people in this garb,
Mhm.
um, I'm sure the material would survive, but I have never personally seen anything
Mhm.
like it. Um, if that's photo evidence, that's really cool, and I would love to
Can't I
see
want to say
something
I see
like
it on
that.
his blog at one point or
Okay,
something.
I'll have to ask him.
Been a few years. Followed that whole conversation very closely because when you teach in Georgia, you're gonna run into somebody who believes in the Black Confederate myths.
Yes. One of my favorite teaching tools was to take the whole idea of the constitutions that were created right
Mm-hmm.
as like and just keyword search slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever you have them pulled up and see how many times did they do that, and you're like,
Right.
okay, so logically, would we really?
Mm-hmm.
Can we really say? I mean, like with Alexander Stevens' cornerstone speech and these, can we honestly say that this is something they would do? And they're like, no,
Yeah. Yeah.
logic.
Oh yeah. I pulled the Mississippi Secession Declaration a few times on people.
Hmm.
It's the beauty in that.
Hmm.
Now you end your book with Gettysburg,
Yeah.
1913. Why?
So that is, I mean, we have the 50th. We do have the 75th.
Hmm.
I have celluloid badges for both in my
Cool.
collection as a crazy person. So I have those. But
Hmm.
I think one of the big things to just kind of wrap up that era is let's talk about the last one that's super official. right?
Hmm.
Let's
Right.
talk about Gettysburg is it is like one of like those, it's like the battle. Like everyone thinks of Gettysburg. Thousands and thousands of people visit Gettysburg a year. I mean, like you forget other things,
Yeah.
but they hold Gettysburg to this
Yeah.
esteem for numerous reasons. But ending the big reunion part with that is, I think, important
Mhm.
because you it really helps show the story that they want to tell at the
Mhm.
end, right? So we're going to start forgetting that
Mhm.
African American people existed or that they went to the reunion.
Mhm.
We're going to shake hands across that wall and have a
Mhm.
really nice shot. And we're all going to be in our nice uniforms and we're going to have our badges. And it's what people remember.
Mhm.
That's what they want people to remember. Do we get full reconciliation? Do we accept
Mhm.
all terms? Do we come back together the way that we're supposed to? No.
Mhm.
But through those pictures and those uniforms and those badges and the way those flags fly, it sure looks like it.
Mhm.
So it creates this perfect image.
Yeah. It helps that nation come together again, right?
Hmm.
So I kind of was drawn into this kind of notion too of who we see and who we don't see, right? Because that was something very important that you pointed out, that
Hmm.
it was not just African Americans, but I think you also had Native Americans who were there who didn't get seen.
Yeah. So I believe that's the point of the reunion, right? Is
Yeah.
those other people don't, how do they fit in the narrative of moving forward?
Hmm.
Um, what's the I mean, the purpose is honestly you should tell the truth, but that is that is a really tall order for some people. So they don't fit in the narrative, and it just classically shows
Right.
what we want to have happen.
Hmm. Right. Though it also I remember I think it was Caroline Janey had made this comment at a conference one time that it's interesting that we have so many pictures of blue and gray reunions because they're so rare, and we don't have the regular reunions because they were all always happening. So Gettysburg is
Hmm.
sort of the perfect example in that, I guess.
Hmm. It's propaganda.
Yeah.
It's this, like I said, it's just this really pretty piece that gets to happen, and it, I mean, it looks nice
Hmm.
and is palatable for the nation to be able to think, oh, okay, this is sure, we're going to be just fine. And
Hmm.
then World War One begins not very long afterwards. And yeah.
Yeah. And wasn't that a mess? Where the shiny, colorful uniforms didn't help anyway.
Nope.
So as we get to the end here for today, because as we said earlier, already an appointment to go to, what what is your most favorite part of this material culture story? Like, is it favorite items that you have about the Civil War and Civil War fabrics, or is it like a story that's associated with something?
Honestly, I think that it's getting to highlight voices that often get ignored.
Mm,
So, Native people, African
mm,
American people, women's work, that in the way that they contribute, not only through the war with everything that they do, but actually getting to see how people felt
mm,
and what they thought and acknowledge their
mhm,
work and their humanity has been the most fascinating and rewarding
mhm,
part of it because after the war, people commemorate, they remember, they try, and this is something that still we see the Confederate flag. We see, and we obviously keep our US flag, but we see these images and kind
mm,
of how it haunts our society. And we
mhm,
haven't really fully reconciled from it, but you just
mhm,
getting to, at least at the very minimum, getting to look at the stories that are often quieted. That's why I
Hmm.
love material culture is you can see so much, you can read items in various ways, and
Hmm.
they say a lot more than text in
Yeah,
some respects.
yeah, yeah. I can see that. Um, Final question. I have to give that for to John Legg, since he in his earlier life was a reenactor, and
Mhm.
John very often pointed out to me when we were in museums that no, this is not right. This is a remade or
Mhm.
a replica item because the stitching is wrong. And
Mhm.
well, this reenactor is not doing it right because the stitching is machine sewed, not real.
Mhm.
Are you kind of like that too, that you can immediately see and spot when something is a replica or machine made versus handmade?
I mean, for me, it takes me just a little while just because I want to be sure. But the, the I deeply respect all
Mhm.
of the effort. I am not someone who's crafty. I do not sew. And so in my head, how they were able to do that is just
Mhm.
it blows my mind. Um, even some of the replica things, whenever
Mhm.
they are done right, it's like, wow, you have talent.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. I had to fix a sewing machine recently so that my wife could sew something. But
Uh-huh.
then I ended up sewing it.
Well, there you go.
Yes, so I know what you're saying very much. Um, but at this stage, you want to go to a museum and see some material culture at Texas A&M?
Yes, I get to go visit the Corps of Cadets collection.
Yes, that will be interesting. It
I'm
would almost be
excited.
like there should be a follow-up to kind of report on what they have.
Yeah, I'm very excited. They have items going back for 100 years, so it's going to be neat.
Yeah, it's too modern for me. I'd stick to the 19th century. Thank you very much.
Well, I think there are a couple that go back to the late 1890s, but we'll see. I'm excited to see what they can get into.
Yeah, well, that's the great part of it, right?
Yep.
So with that then, thank you so much. If you were interested in the book, I'll hold it up, but it will also be in that corner later or during the interview. The Fabric of Civil War Society, Uniforms, Badges, and Flags from LSU Press. So thank you so much for joining us, Shae.
Thank you so much. It was a great conversation.